Good afternoon, everyone that's tuning in today from hopefully all of New Zealand and across the Motu. Welcome to the first session in our Blood Cancer Patient Forum for 2022. Our opening session called Welcome and Update, We've Got Your Back. As you can see, we've got our lovely panel of speakers today. Our first speaker that's coming up is Peter Fergusson, CEO, and he's going to give us updates on LBC advocacy and research support. We also have Peter Browett, Medical Director, Cushla Lucas, Regional Manager for Te Kahu, and Raewyn Moss, our Consumer Advisory Board for Leukemia and Blood Cancer New Zealand representative. They'll give their talks later on. But at this time, we'll hand the time over to our CEO, Peter Fergusson.
So thank you, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of LBC this afternoon. I hope that you're all safe and well and your Wi-Fi is coping. This event tends to reflect the nervously changing times we still face. We're hosting this event virtually, plus a range of in-person gatherings around the country. So it's a bit of a dual delivery event, and I'm conscious that these sorts of hybrid gatherings can come with the usual awkward moments, like technology freezing, being on mute, and a few unusual backgrounds. So I just want to thank everyone in advance for your patience as we deliver the blended Blood Cancer Patient Forum. I particularly want to thank my dedicated support services team. They've worked so hard behind the scenes to bring this forum together in this dual format, and certainly organising the venues, wrangling with technology, and delivering a fantastic lineup of key speakers is not always easy. So big thanks to them. I'm also going to throw out a plug for my fundraising and marketing team. They walked away with 2 awards last night at the Fundraising Institute New Zealand Awards, so I'm very, very proud of them. We rely so heavily on the amazing work that they do to raise funds that are needed to be able to deliver this important work, as well as caring for patients and families and our research. So a big thank you to them. And my final thank you before we kick off is an important thanks to acknowledge the generous sponsorship of ANZ Staff Foundation, who have once again thrown their support behind us, which allows us to deliver this valuable forum each year. Now, for my sins today, I have 2 topics. I've been asked to touch briefly on advocacy and research, and I'm conscious that in the short time frame that I've got, I won't give either of them the depth that they deserve. However, I do know that we have speakers later in this event who'll spend more time and add more depth to those topics for you, so bear with me a little. So first up, advocacy and awareness. Look, this is one of the more complex, difficult and frequently frustrating aspects that we are challenged with. As a broad rule, we tend to use a whole range of channels. Our greatest traction is usually when we can leverage collective pressure, and that's using other groups in conjunction with ourselves, and when we're invited to sit at a table, so an influencing table where we can help make decisions. So we tend to work really hard on relationships internally and behind the scenes that give us access to those tables that are making decisions. And as a few examples, the Alliance of Cancer Agencies, which is known affectionately as CANGO. So there's 9 key cancer groups, which includes organisations like the Cancer Society, breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, bowel cancer, melanoma, stomach cancer, gynecological cancers, to name a few. We all meet regularly and share what we're doing and how we're doing it. And despite our varying sizes, we all find that advocating alone often doesn't have the weight needed to gain the attention of the ministers. So as a collective, it helps us represent a wider range of cancer patients, and it gives us far greater traction and voice. So this has become a really key and relatively successful way to collaborate and open the doors to reach some of those decision makers. Usually one of the key elements to that is finding the agreed commonalities between those groups, but we do have those agreed commonalities. Election year is always a big time for us as well. We gain greater traction. Ministers understandably become a little bit more interested in what the public is saying in the lead up to elections. So we're already gearing up now for 2023 and starting that conversation with the government and ministers across all parties. So to give you an idea, the agreed priority topics that the broader Kango group will be delivering to government over the next probably 12 months. First and foremost, no surprise, better access to medicines. So that's really pushing the boat around Pharmac and the ongoing pressure to lift funding. That remains a real key, the funding element to that. Secondly, the needs of those living with cancer, and that's the wraparound services that often come from organisations like Leukemia and Blood Cancer to patients and families. We're looking for greater recognition for that work and funding to help us and to help you outside those hospital walls around travel and parking and accommodation and some of the other expenses that land on the plates of people going through this journey. And it's often left to charities to support that by default, which is, to be honest, not good enough. The third element that we'll be pushing hard is increased access to clinical trials and investigator-led research. You'll all be aware that there's some exciting new areas that are coming up, and I'm sure people will talk about these as the forum continues, things like immunotherapy and certainly the CAR T trials that are going on at the moment. And last but not least, the accuracy and speed of detecting and diagnosing cancer. For us, it's probably more around upskilling primary care and their awareness to be able to diagnose early. For a lot of the other cancers, it's around screening services. So those are the four key elements that we'll be pushing as a priority as we go into election year next year. One of the other groups that you'll hear from today in a wee while's time, and a group that we work quite closely with, is Te Kahu, which is the Cancer Control Agency. There is a National Haematology Working Group, which LBC is part of. It consists of all the lead clinicians around the country, and LBC is there providing patient voice and perspective as much as we can. This group has shifted out of the Ministry of Health previously to become a key specialist voice and a growing influence and a trusted advisory panel into the Cancer Agency. And certainly my general opinion of late and since it's moved to Te Kahu is that I think there's a real ability now to have some impact and increase the influence into decision making around what's happening in the blood cancer space. You'll hear from Te Kahu, which is Cushla Lucas, who's a speaker in a little while's time later on in this forum, and I'm sure she'll give you greater detail of what Te Kahu is up to and possibly what they're planning and contributing already. Thirdly, third channel for advocacy obviously is directly to Pharmac, and we do that primarily through submissions. So we regularly undertake formal submissions for medicines and treatments. Those are new treatments, existing treatments, unfunded treatments, and obviously giving them our advice on their waiting lists and what needs to be prioritised. Usually this is done in conjunction with clinicians, so they're usually clinician-led requests that we get in behind and add our weight to. And on occasions, we do get invited to make submissions by Pharmac themselves, although that's reasonably rare. LBC has also made, I should say, a very detailed and lengthy submission into the Pharmac review that was finished some time ago, just at the beginning of this year. And we continue primarily through Kango to follow up and those final recommendations so that we can see where they're tracking to and what's happening with that report. In the last couple of areas, obviously a broader awareness. This forum today kicks off what is the Blood Cancer Awareness Month, which is September. So the Blood Cancer Awareness Month has a focus on symptom recognition, highlighting the plight of blood cancer patients and the challenges they have in their journey. It's a collaboration which I love with the USA, UK, Canada, and Australia. And it's a campaign that we get pushed across media and social media areas as well. So you should see more and more of this over the next month. It's our second year of this relationship with the wider international group. And it's really there to promote and push blood cancer awareness during this month, certainly around symptoms. In addition to that, and many of you will know this, we create a raft of materials and educational forums, and that's mostly to lift the understanding of the general public, but we also target the primary sector as well, so that GPs in some of the more remote areas recognise and diagnose blood cancer symptoms early. So quite a bit of work in there. And last but not least, the media. We use the media in some respects. We certainly create media content and we respond to media inquiry. At times that's proactive. Equally, it can be reactive. So around topical events, unexpected announcements, which happen on the odd occasion. The obvious usual ones like lack of funding, the priority funded treatments and lack of decisions or announcements. So we're regularly in contact with media around those sorts of things. Secondly, and on to what is our vision, which is a vision to cure, and that's research. A big part of what we're here to do. LBC annually funds an array of research projects and professional development, and certainly in the last 12 months, we've spent just under $500,000 on those sorts of projects and development opportunities. As an example, we've had 3 research projects approved. 2 of those went to Otago, 1 to Auckland. We fund a PhD scholarship. That's in its 3rd year, and that's really targeted at retaining some of our brightest young specialists. And this year we've got 2 PhD scholarships budgeted for 22-23, which is fantastic. We are involved with funding and supporting the CAR-T trial out of the Mulligan Institute. We wrap our support around patient support, making sure that patients can attend this trial without being personally impacted financially. So we're targeting patient support around that trial. We provide summer studentships, usually around about 6 a year. We undertake a range of travel grants, usually to key international conferences. Often these are targeted at nursing staff who don't get that sort of support. And last but not least, we fund the Leukemia and Blood Cancer Research Unit. That's a 10-year partnership between Leukemia and Blood Cancer and Auckland University. It's the only dedicated research unit in New Zealand that's specifically concentrating on blood cancer research. And LBC over the 10-year period has donated now $3 million towards that research unit, which is fantastic. Something that will continue on for quite some time, I believe. And this year, 22-23, we've already budgeted to lift our research investment by 25%. So there's a real intent to continue to grow that. And in addition to that, LBC has created a separate endowment trust that's been specifically designed to raise and invest funds for the support of ongoing growth of blood cancer research. And that's certainly reflected in our vision and mission. They've already secured a number of valuable donations. Many of those are tagged to research. These funds are now starting to flow back to LBC via grants, and it's starting to lift our investment into research. So now and going forward, so there's a real potential to make a difference in the future in that space, which hopefully becomes the perfect segue into our next speaker, which is Peter Browett, Dr. Peter Browett, who amongst other things heads up leukemia and blood cancer research. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Hopefully I've shared something of interest, and my very best wishes for the remainder of this forum. Back to you, Tim.
Thanks, Peter, for your awesome words. Just a reminder to those who are tuning in, we have a question and answer section at the bottom. If you'd like to ask any questions, please do so in that section. And at the end of the session, we'll have all the panelists on the same screen, and we'll answer all of our questions at the end. Thank you. Now we're just handing the time over to our Medical Director, Peter Browett, who will give us updates on blood cancer treatment on the horizon, role as Medical Director as well. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you for the kind invitation to talk to this meeting. What I'd like to do is talk, just follow on from Peter's talk a little bit about sort of why we support research and the impact of it, and then just what I see as the key advances that are happening in the blood cancer area. So as Peter has outlined in his talk, I mean, the key pillars of LBC are patient and whanau support, advocacy, which Peter has discussed, and supportive research. And so we want to pick up on the points that Peter had raised as to, why is it important that we do blood cancer research in New Zealand? A little bit about the landscape of blood cancer research, and Peter has already introduced that. And then that leads nicely into what I see are the key breakthrough areas in blood cancer. So, a lot of people say, well, why do we support blood cancer research in New Zealand? Why, how can we compete with, the big investment in research in North America, Europe, the UK? And I think it's still critical that we have blood cancer and we support blood cancer research. So the work of LBC is really sort of crucial. And it's clear that when we invest in blood cancer research, that it improves the outcome for our patients, both in understanding the biology of the disease, improving our diagnostic and prognostic information. So in other words, being able to identify why some patients with a lymphoma or myeloma go into remission and do very well, and other patients, the response is not what we'd anticipate. And then finally, being able to develop sort of better treatment, better support care, better outcomes for patients. But it's also, there are a number of health issues that are critical to the New Zealand environment that aren't going to be done internationally. There's a lot of work has emerged around the inequity and outcomes, particularly amongst Māori and Pacifica sort of patients, and research trying to identify that and improve that can only be done in our environment. For example, some of the blood cancers, myeloma, have a higher incidence in Māori, and LBC has actually sort of just provided support for sort of further research on that. Finally, is that although some of our research is using similar technology that is developed internationally, for example, the CAR T cell area, what we've learned during the period of lockdown is that we need to develop that technology. We need to develop the science behind it. We need to train the clinicians and the scientists in that area. That is the only way these technologies will be developed in the New Zealand environment. What's clear is that units and health services that have strong support for research have better outcomes for their patients. So not just for the patients that are on the clinical trial, but there is good data that units and services that are actively involved in research have better outcomes for their patients. And here's just an example, and in New Zealand is that all centres have over the last, well, actually over more than a decade, coming up for 2 decades, have managed patients with acute myeloid leukemia in collaboration with clinical investigators in the United Kingdom. And despite until recently the lack of funding for new drugs in the AML area, is that involvement in research has improved the outcome for New Zealand patients with acute myeloid leukemia. And if you look at the slide on the right-hand side, this just shows outcome patients by time periods, with the green slide where only 20% of our patients were long-term sort of cures, and that was in the late 1990s. If when we look at the last 5-year period, and that's the yellow line at the top, when patients were enrolled on a trial called acute AML 19, you can see the significant improvement in outcomes. And that's really using the same drugs that we've always had, but using them in a better way, and also better support care for patients. And across all of the blood cancers, you can demonstrate better outcomes where groups have been involved in research. The other important reason that is it's harder to measure, but blood cancer also, research into blood cancer is also essential in training a workforce. And probably the most important part, is the people. And that's both the scientists, the clinicians, those involved in supporting of research. And one of the things that we've seen through that supportive research that Peter outlined to you is that we're starting to build up that critical workforce. And that's essential, both for the ongoing research, but also if we want to introduce these new technologies into New Zealand environment, for example, the CAR T cells, then we need to have that workforce, and supporting research as a way of both training and retaining that workforce. And you'll have seen a lot in the media recently about the pressures on staff in the healthcare sector. I think it extends beyond just those at the front line, the nurses and medical staff. It also extends into the laboratory and into the research environment as well. And we're at risk of losing our critical researchers and that critical workforce sort of internationally. So the support of research, there's a whole lot of areas of why it's so critical. So specific New Zealand issues, building new technologies into the New Zealand environment so that we can improve outcomes for patients, and building up a critical workforce. Peter has sort of touched on this, but if we look into say, well, what is the landscape? What type of blood cancer research do we undertake in New Zealand? So probably the largest of that is in the clinical trial area. And that's both what we call industry-driven or industry-sponsored research. So this is research that is generated by the pharmaceutical industry, usually what we call phase 3 trials that are comparing a new therapy against a standard of care treatment. And these trials, we actively engage in those because they provide our patients access to new therapies that they may not otherwise be able to have, but also it's addressing important clinical questions. The other research, which I think is one that particularly within LBC we're wanting to increase, is around investigator-driven research. So that's, for example, where one of my colleagues may have an interest in a particular disease and is interested in doing a clinical trial that he or she feels is going to add knowledge and improve and have benefits for patients, and that we need to be able to support that research. And a lot of that is in collaboration with colleagues both across New Zealand, but also with colleagues in Australia. So that's our clinical trial research. The second type of research that we support is around looking at the basic science and biology of disease. So this may seem to have a further distance away from the clinic, but it's trying to ask the question as to what is the cause of this type of blood cancer, and how might we use that understanding of the cause to develop better therapies. And so that's an important type of research as well. And finally, we support what we call translational research. So this is often added on to a clinical trial where we're looking at laboratory studies that may provide additional information that supports the findings of the clinical treatment for patients. So Peter touched on these, and I'll just highlight a couple of issues. So if we look at the LBC supportive research, as Peter emphasised, we're critical in supporting people, and that's the summer research studentships and the doctoral scholarship. So this is students undertaking a PhD. This is the key research training degree. Secondly, we support project grants. So these are competitive grants that are submitted, that are reviewed by our medical committee, and that's across the spectrum from basic leukemia biology into clinical trials and support care and outcome research. And then thirdly, we've got the support of the LBC research unit at the University of Auckland. And if we just look at the LBC research unit, is that this unit has two goals. So one is around using patient samples to understand better the different blood cancer diseases and why patients respond to different treatments. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this around the field of personalized hematology. And then there's a more basic science component to it. And this is using models of leukemia to try and understand why the leukemia develops and whether we can develop newer and better strategies for treating that leukemia. And that work with some of the models is moving into the immunotherapy sort of area, of which is, again, Peter touched on, and I will also touch on around the cancer immunotherapy and the CAR T cell is perhaps one of the biggest advances around in the blood cancer area. So the final part of my talk is that I wanted to just highlight that, okay, well, what are the advances? Where are things moving? And I think there's two big changes. If I have to look and say over the last 4 or 5 years, what are the key changes and the big advances? So one is in the area of cancer immunotherapy. So that's using the body's immune system to help control the cancer. And the second is in understanding more about the DNA, the sort of the machinery that controls the myeloma or the lymphoma or the leukemia cell, asking the question, what has gone wrong and how can we use that to improve treatments for patients? If I can start initially on around the sort of the diving down the genomics, and I've called this sort of personalized hematology, and this is one of the major research goals of the LBC research unit, is that when we look at a patient with acute leukemia, is that patients present in a very similar way, and under the microscope, the leukemias have similar laboratory appearances. But the disease is massively heterogeneous with quite significant and variable outcomes between patients. So the question we want to ask is, well, how can we better sort of understand those differences so that we can individualize therapy for patients, so that we can give the right treatment to the right patient at the right time? And it's this field of personalized hematology. So many of you've been diagnosed with a myeloma or a lymphoma or a leukemia, you may have heard your clinician talk about sort of cytogenetic or chromosome changes or FISH studies. And so that's been an important sort of step forward in understanding the genetics of leukemia and other blood cancers. But in some ways, it's like going to a library and you can tell that there may be 1 or 2 books missing from the library, but you've got no idea whether there are chapters missing from from many of the books that are still in the library, or critical spelling mistakes in those books. And that's the field of molecular genetics, the ability not just to look at the books themselves and see whether they're there, but also to look at each page, at each word, to check for spelling mistakes. And that's the field of molecular genetics, of being able to sequence all the relevant genes that are within the human genome. And so sort of 2 to 3 decades ago, when the human genome was sequenced, that took over 10 years and cost around $13 billion dollars. Now within our laboratory, and courtesy of support out of LBC, we have, and many labs have, these next generation sequences that are able to, over 24 hours, sequence the entire human genome. So that means that we can look at the DNA from a myeloma or a lymphoma or a leukemia and look at not just if there's some books missing or they're in the wrong place, we can look to see if there are spelling mistakes on each page within those books. So the study we initiated was in acute myeloid leukemia, and we developed a panel, and we didn't look at all the genome. We looked initially at just under 80 genes that are commonly involved in an acute leukemia. We've now expanded that, and we look at 111 sort of genes. And this is just showing down on this on the left-hand side. Here's the different genes we sort of look at in each case. And so what we wanted to do was look and see, were the particular mutations or spelling mistakes that may change a protein that might be a target for therapy? Secondly, is that might it provide additional information that could change the prognosis for a patient? And thirdly, could it give us a marker that we could then follow the patient and assess how well they're doing, their response to treatment? So the first thing we found is that virtually each patient we look at has a different genetic profile, a different set of spelling mistakes or mutations. So if we look at the right-hand panel, so down here are the different genes we looked at, and across here, this was the first 22 patients we looked at, and each yellow dot is a mutation. And so what you can see is that here's a group of 20 patients with acute myeloid leukemia that all look the same under the microscope, are all going to have broadly the same treatment, but you can see that each patient has got a different molecular profile. So it's not surprising that we have different outcomes when we treat patients all in the same manner. So using that genetic profile and comparing it back to large international trials is that we can subdivide patients into different prognostic groups based on that molecular profile. So this is just showing these are what we call outcome curves for patients. So, and these are the different molecular subgroups or genetic subgroups of leukemia. And you can see some patients have a molecular profile that has a very favorable outcome, where 70 to 80% of patients are going to be long-term survivors with treatment, whereas other patients have got mutations or molecular profile that with a conventional treatment that there's a high risk of relapse, and we would look for different treatment for these patients to look and try and improve their outcome. So we've analysed the first just over 100 patients that we looked at, and what this slide shows is that the mean number of mutations that we saw in each case was just over 3, and you can see there's a whole range, and some patients have many mutations, many spelling mistakes within the DNA of their leukemia. And this just highlights, this is the range of mutations. So here's the genes along the bottom and just the number of patients that had mutations in each of those genes. We then asked the question is, well, how many patients would we change treatment based on that molecular profile? For example, perhaps the molecular profile would suggest a less good outcome with chemotherapy alone, and that we'd look to do a stem cell transplant early on. Alternatively, the other way around, that a molecular profile that looked for a better outcome. So in the grey is the risk group based on the conventional morphology and chromosome studies, and the orange were the changes that occurred with the molecular testing. And you can see that 30% of patients changed their prognostic group, and just under 20% of patients we recommended a change of treatment based on that genetic profile. In addition, 50% of patients had a mutation that would predict for being able to respond to some form of targeted sort of therapy. And here's an example. So IDH is a mutation that we see in around 10% of patients, and there are now specific IDH inhibitors, and we've just opened a clinical trial that is looking at adding an IDH inhibitor to conventional leukemia chemotherapy, with the goal being is this going to improve outcomes for our patients? And over 90% of patients had a biomarker that we can use to monitor the response to treatment. What I mean by that is that conventionally remission is defined by the leukemia cell being less than 5%, but we know there's still a significant number of leukemia cells left. And so what we want is to be able to tick down to much lower levels. And so in our lab, we do special tests, what we call measurable or minimal residual disease. And one of the markers we look at is MPM1, and we can detect this down to a level of 1 in a million. This is a strategy that is well established in chronic myeloid leukemia, where we test for the BCR-ABL fusion gene, and we can test down to this level, and it's now moving into acute myeloid leukemia and acute lymphoblastic leukemia as well. So just summarizing this bit of our work, and this is, you know, internationally, is that, you know, the ability to look at the genes involved in acute myeloid leukemia gives us information around the diagnosis, the prognosis, targets for therapy, is it working, so detection of minimal residual disease. And an unexpected finding is that we found about 5% of patients that had an inherited risk factor for leukemia, which is something we didn't know about at the time we started this work. Where are we taking it? So we're ongoing with the being able to detect the measurable residual disease. We're doing more work on the familial risk for leukemia, and we're about to start a research project with a similar panel in the lymphoma and multiple myeloma area. But also, as I'm coming back to that, to my original point, is that this has also helped train people around this technology. So we're starting to build up scientists and clinicians who have got expertise in the genomics, so building up that critical mass. And also the work, although we started this as a trial, it's now across the country. And so all centres are taking advantage of doing molecular testing in acute myeloid leukemia. We've developed national guidelines. Just 2 weeks ago, we had the first of a meeting looking at establishment of a panel for how we investigate around the familial predisposition. And we're looking at initiatives between the research and service laboratories within, certainly in the Auckland Hospital and across the country as well. The other and just a big area that is really exciting is around the cancer immunotherapy area. So this is where we want to use the body's immune system to attack the cancer. And there's 3 areas that this is developed. So there's antibody-based strategies, and many of you may be familiar and maybe even received treatment with the monoclonal antibody rituximab, which is used in treatment of lymphoma. But now there are strategies to improve that antibody approach. And there's antibody drug conjugate, where we attach a toxin onto the antibody, and what are called BiTE antibodies, or bispecific T-cell engager antibodies. The second area, which is probably more in the non-blood, the solid tumors, so melanoma, lung cancer are the checkpoint inhibitors. So this is a way of unlocking the body's immune system so that it can attack the malignancy. And then the third, and the one that's most exciting, is in the cell therapy area. So a couple of slides just on the antibodies. So if we look at the antibody drug conjugates, as though rituximab is an antibody that just binds on to the lymphoma cell and then activates the immune system. This strategy is that using linkers, of which there's expertise in New Zealand amongst medicinal chemists to develop these linkers, is that then a toxin, a poison, is added onto the antibody so that it is delivered directly to the lymphoma or leukemia or cancer cell. And an example of this is the anti-CD30 monoclonal antibody brentuximab, which was used in treatment of patients with Hodgkin lymphoma and some other lymphomas as well. And that's currently before Pharmac, waiting a decision on funding. The other area of the antibodies are what are called BiTE antibodies. So the BI stands for bispecific, and then the TE is T-cell engager. So this is the BiTE antibody here. And what it does is it links an antibody that binds onto the immune system cell, the T cell, and then another antibody that links on to the leukemia cell or the lymphoma cell. So essentially, you're bringing together the immune system and the cancer cells side by side. And there are exciting trials underway. We've got a trial open in lymphoma. We're about to open one in myeloma. In ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the bispecific antibody blinatumomab is licensed and funded in most countries, and that is again before Pharmac, awaiting decision on funding there. Some of you may have seen this in the media on Monday, as so this was stuff on the Fairfax website. So this, the article, this is David Downs, who's well known and very supportive of LBC, who's one of the first patients in New Zealand to have CAR T-cell therapy. So he had relapsed refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and went to the US and was enrolled on a clinical trial and had a CAR T-cell therapy 5 years ago and is in a stable, durable remission. This article related to the Environmental Protection Agency approving from their jurisdiction the genetic construct used for a CAR T-cell therapy in myeloma. So it was the first part of it that they looked at the genetic construct, and just as they review other genetically modified organisms to make sure they're safe in the New Zealand environment, they provided that approval. The next steps will be registration through MedSafe, and then to the funding body, probably Pharmac, although there is debate as to whether this is a drug or a cell therapy. So the CAR T cells are well established internationally, and this was the first Emily Whitehead, who was treated for acute lymphoblastic leukemia back nearly 10 years ago. And she had relapsed acute lymphoblastic leukemia, had failed multiple lines of therapy, and she was the first person to receive CAR T cells. And what CAR T cells are is that the patient's own immune system cells, so their T cells are collected, they're then taken to the laboratory and they're genetically modified. They're inserted with a gene that encodes for a protein that recognizes antigens or proteins on the lymphoma or the leukemia or the myeloma cell, and then that's attached to part of the gene or the protein that will stimulate the T cells. So it's got two parts. It's got a gene that makes a receptor that recognizes the cancer cell, and then the second bit is the T cell stimulation part. So that gene is put into the T cells, they're expanded, and it makes this killer T cell, and then those cells, so the patient's own genetically modified T cells, the CAR T cells, are reinfused back into the patient, where they home in on the lymphoma or the myeloma or leukemia and induced cell death. So Emily is now, in fact, this is a couple of years, she's now 8 years out, and famously she got to see Barack Obama when he was president of the United States, and asked him for her absence slip for not being at school that day. Where are we in New Zealand? So there is a clinical trial by our colleagues at the Mulligan Institute in Wellington Hospital, led by Dr. Rob Winecove. So this is a phase 1 trial. So this is basically a new 3rd generation construct in patients with lymphoma. So this is a study. Phase 1 is where you're looking at the safety of the protocol. So that is underway. There are a small number of patients in the pediatric sector who have gone to Australia for CAR T-cell therapy, and a small number of adult patients who have gone to the US or other centres for CAR T therapy. So at the moment, we don't have CAR Ts as part of routine care in New Zealand. It is funded in the UK in lymphoma and acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children and adolescents, and in Australia for the same sort of indications. So I think there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon. The genomics, the genetic work testing is here now. The cell immunotherapy is that we've got a number of treatments that are before Pharmac, awaiting decisions on funding. The CAR T-cell therapy is something that we need to be moving forward on. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, I'd like to just thank the incredible work of LBC in supporting the research across the country, across all areas of blood cancer, and specifically the LBC research unit and the AML gene panel work. So thank you, and I'll hand back over to Tim.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Peter Browett, for your awesome words. If we had an audience, they'll be clapping for Dr. Peter Browett, who's also a consultant hematologist at Auckland Hospital and an awesome professor, from what I hear. Next up, we have Cushla Lucas, who is a regional manager for Te Kahu, and she'll share with us how they are supporting blood cancer patients and their families. Thank you, Cushla. Over to you.
Thank you, Tim. And tēnā koutou katoa, ko Cushla Lucas tōku ingoa. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this amazing event. My name is Cushla Lucas, and I am proudly based in the Manawatu, speaking tonight from Palmerston North. And in my mahi as Regional Manager for Te Kahu, the Cancer Control Agency, but I've also most recently been leading a national project looking at stem cell transplant, a topic I'm sure is very close to the heart for many of the people online today. So this afternoon, I wanted to share with you our journey as an agency, which grew from the aspirations of passionate advocates at a cancer conference in 2019 to a thriving organisation today. I also want to tell you about a specific program of work we are doing to strive for better ways to deliver cancer treatment, including chemotherapy and stem cell transplant. And lastly, to talk about how we connect across this mahi with those who matter most, people in whanau. The last cancer action plan in New Zealand before the conference was in 2003. And since that time, not only has cancer remained a leading cause of death, but we expect that cancer cases will double in the next 2 decades. Now, the 2003 plan was a very good plan, and despite the efforts of many passionate advocates and individuals, some of whom will be on this call this afternoon, And even though our outcomes are improving, this is happening more slowly than other countries, and there are many inequities or unfair differences in cancer survival, which can be due to things such as where you live, your ethnicity, your identity, and the cancer you have. So in January 2019, nearly 400 people came together at the Cancer Care at a Crossroads conference. Now, this was probably the most significant cancer-focused conference ever held in New Zealand, and included people with a lived experience of cancer, healthcare providers, clinicians, leaders from all parts of the cancer sector, policymakers, non-government organisations, and I'm sure included Leukemia and Blood Cancer New Zealand, and the community. And overwhelmingly, the people there endorsed that we urgently needed strong central leadership in the form of a national cancer agency to provide evidence-based cancer control. Now, shortly after the conference, a public referendum was launched by Blair and Melissa Vining, calling on the government for a cancer control agency. Over 130,000 people signed this petition, making it the biggest ever cancer-related petition in New Zealand. Tragically, Blair passed away in July that year, but his wife Melissa continues her advocacy to this day. And so in December 2019, the Cancer Control Agency opened, and our, as it was at that time, interim chief executive, Professor Diana Safati, was appointed. Now, our structure is a little bit different from previous ways we've looked at cancer control. As a departmental agency, we've been set up to report directly to the Minister of Health, giving cancer a much bigger voice and a mandate to shape an environment where everyone can thrive. And similar to how Peter said LBC works, we do this by engaging with others, influencing and leveraging wherever and whenever we can, and being agile, so in this unpredictable world, we can be ready to adapt. Our name, Te Kahu, was gifted to us by Heahuru Mowai, the Māori Cancer Leadership Network. Now, the name refers to the central thread of the cloak. The aho, or thread, symbolises the agency and its role as a leader and connector, while the kahu, the cloak, symbolises all the services, organisations, peoples and communities that work with those affected by cancer. Our purpose is to lead and unite the efforts to improve cancer outcomes for all New Zealanders, and this is embodied in our name. We're a value-driven organisation, and in delivering to our vision of fewer cancers, better survival and equity for all, we live by the following values, which describe both what is explicitly within our work, but also how we behave. So we're equity-led first and foremost. We strive for equity for all New Zealanders. We're whanau-centred. We put people at the heart of all our work. We're knowledge-driven. We're guided by the best information and insights that we can gather. And we're outcomes-focused, which means we relentlessly drive to deliver better results for all. So how do we do this? Well, we advise government on the right design and function for cancer services, including how to go about addressing problems that are happening for people right here and now. We bring people together, not just clinicians, but people like yourselves who have lived experience of cancer, to think about and agree on what matters most. We lead specific projects, and I'll talk some more about those today. We pull together and share data and information, which means we can all make better decisions and monitor that things are truly improving, or not, if that is the case. We support service providers when there are challenges, and whether these be simply to face growing demands or manage staff shortages, or much more unexpected events such as cyber attacks and global pandemics. Also, as a result of the conference, a 10-year action plan was written for cancer care in New Zealand, and the plan sets out 4 goals to improve cancer outcomes, which are on the slide. Te Kahu has a lead role in this plan, including how to oversee the progress towards these goals and outcomes. So it's a pretty big job. Now, people often say to me that while they welcome a focus on better cancer outcomes, what will actually be different? And while there is a long list of specific changes to make, in general, we believe cancer outcomes will improve when there are positive and enduring relationships between everyone that's involved in cancer care. When risk factors are decreasing, not just overall, but for all groups, that the care available is of high quality, it's connected, and it's consistently delivered regardless of where you live, and that there is ongoing sustainable quality improvement. That those things that are unfair in the system and cause inequities are called out and addressed, and that happens on an ongoing basis. And that we all work together, so it's clear that people and whanau are at the centre of everything we do. So fair enough, what have we done so far? Well, firstly, we know that there is still a great deal to do, but for us, it's been an incredibly busy time since we started in December 2019. First, there was Christmas, and then there was COVID. As Aotearoa became the team of 5 million, it was never more important for the cancer sector to connect and ensure high quality care continued to be available to those who needed it. A COVID Cancer Action Response team was assembled of clinical leaders from across the treatment sector. And through this forum, guidance was about having cancer treatment was able to be provided at pace and publicised. Monitoring was established to measure the impact of COVID on a set of key metrics that reflected points along the cancer treatment continuum. And this reporting continues to be produced at both a national and a hospital level. We stood up a website and we're active on LinkedIn and Twitter. Now, I'm noting for the younger audience that is not exactly cutting edge in social media, but our website is visited more than 25,000 times a year. And you'll find detail about most of the things in this presentation on our website. In 2020, we published a State of the Nation report, which is a summary of the available data across the cancer continuum and does touch on cancer research, you'll be pleased to know. The report showed that we have gaps in our knowledge and our performance and provides an important baseline for going forward. In 2021, another report was produced focusing on cancer prevention. The same year, we travelled the country to connect with whanau Māori, working alongside local cancer service providers, Māori leaders and communities. We delivered 13 hui from Kaikohe to Invercargill, reaching over 2,500 people. You'll see leukemia and blood in the photos. And the purpose of the hui was to hear the voice of whanau and to co-design solutions to the issues raised. The hui also included free health checks, health promotion activities, primary care enrolment and screening enrolment and delivery. And it was an experience that has shaped our organisation and had a profound impact on all our team involved, many of who had only recently joined the agency at that time. We've been involved in Pacific research, looking at consumer perspectives of cancer care from diagnosis to post-treatment, or COPE for short. Research that included the voices of Pacifica people with leukemia. We're also looking at how we can better connect with people with cancer who are also living with a disability. We have an extensive data program focusing on monitoring and quality, including an overarching program to bring together cancer data into one source, meaning we can better monitor and drive change in the future. We have a quality indicator program looking at specific points along the diagnosis and treatment pathway. We recently produced a report looking at cancer medicines, and we have partnered in funding cancer research. In line with our role to connect across the system, we've formed many relationships. We work with Māori cancer leaders who not only gifted our name, but also provide expertise and support for patients centred on improving Māori cancer outcomes. We have an advisory council who supports work on our strategic direction, a clinical assembly which captures the expertise of our clinicians from a broad range of cancer-related medical, nursing and allied health specialties. And as Peter Fergusson mentioned, we have a specialty working group based on treatment types, including a national working group for clinical haematology. And we have the wonderful Aratangata, our consumer reference group, who keeps us focused on the experience of patients and whanau. At this point, I would also like to acknowledge that it can seem like cancer control often focuses on the solid tumours, such as lung cancer or breast cancer, and by comparison, not as much on blood cancer. And I wanted to assure you that we're absolutely aware that blood cancer, especially when considered collectively, affects a significant number of New Zealanders every year. And improving outcomes and the experience for people with blood cancer is critically important to the agency. We highly value the connections and advice we receive from haematologists, other health sector clinicians, and from organisations like LBC, who actively advocate to ensure the needs of people with blood cancer and their whanau are front and centre in any work to improve the system. And we absolutely want to keep working together on this important aspect of cancer control. At the moment, we have a large program of work underway that seeks to transform the way adult cancer treatment services are provided. We have called it rather descriptively cancer services planning. We know that people, in particular Māori and Pacific cancer patients, but also those living rurally and in tough financial situations, do not see the same benefits from treatment as other groups, and often experience significant inequities, both in terms of outcomes, but also in the burden of going through treatment and suffer long-term hardship as a consequence. Phase 1 of our Cancer Services Planning Program happened last year. And in this phase, we connected with a wide range of people affected by cancer, including patients, whanau, community and clinicians, to understand what is and isn't working well in the current system. We also looked at international best practice to see what could work in our context here in New Zealand. This led to a vision document outlining the delivery of cancer treatment services within a transformed health system. Now, this refers to the health reforms that changed the system from the DHBs in July this year and provides us with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to radically improve cancer services. Now, our agency was not part of this structural change, and we remain reporting directly to the Minister of Health, but we have new partners in Health New Zealand, Te Whatuora, and the Māori Health Authority, Te Whatuora. The guidance in the Phase 1 document sets the building blocks for a revision of the system as it applies to cancer treatment. Now, there were many recommendations, 340 pages worth to be exact, but we also found some themes that won't be a surprise to anyone here. Across all types of treatment, we were told that better leadership and better planning was needed, that we needed more and different workforces if the system was to be high quality and sustainable, that we need to look at facilities and where treatment is delivered, and that the support for patients in whanau needed to improve if the system was to be equitable and whanau-centred. We also heard some specific issues for people with blood cancer. We heard about the impact that growing demand and COVID has had on transplant and chemotherapy services and on the people needing to access those services. We learned that while there is much better access to cell donors, meaning more and more people could benefit from a transplant, that this has seen demand grow quickly and exponentially, meaning the services are needing to grow to keep pace. We heard that it is hard work just keeping up just now, and that makes it hard to find the time to innovate and introduce new ways of working. But we also heard that despite the challenges, there remains a passion for research and to do better in treating blood cancer, which Professor Browett explained much better than I ever could just now, especially noting the CAR-T trial in Wellington. We know that there are differences in outcomes and access to services across the country and between groups. For example, as mentioned in his talk, when we look at cancer registrations from 2017, we saw that Māori had higher rates for leukemia, lymphoma and myeloma, while Pacific people had higher rates of myeloma and lymphoma. And from 2016 data, we saw that mortality rates for blood cancer generally were higher for Māori and Pacific people compared with non-Māori and non-Pacific people. We came to understand how technical and complex a stem cell transplant is, and how this means that there can only be a small number of delivery sites to ensure quality, safety and stability. But we also know that for many people, having to travel and stay away from home causes increased burden, undue hardship, and is a significant barrier to having treatment. And we were told that when it's just too hard to access a transplant, then people need to rely on less effective treatment, which can lead to more symptoms, less quality of life, and sometimes even avoidable death, which tells us clearly about the need to think holistically when designing the system, or the kahu, that wraps around people accessing blood cancer treatment. So what next? The next step in cancer services planning is to provide more detailed advice and support to the new health system. This is where we go beyond what changes need to happen to how they actually can happen. 7 projects have been established to draw together this advice. These projects span cancer treatment and their connections are shown on the slide, but I'll touch on 3 key areas of interest. The first is to focus on cancer coordination services. Initially focused on Māori and Pacific patients and their whanau, this work draws together how we can build coordination services that are consistently available across the country, high in quality, but also tailored to reflect what is needed in local communities, and to work alongside in partnership, recognising the amazing work that happens by many of our non-government organisations already working in this space. For systemic therapy or chemotherapy services, we know the care for people who are having not only chemotherapy, but immunotherapy, targeted therapy, and hormone therapy is becoming more complex. And this means we need not only more places and ways to give these therapies, but also more connected services like laboratories and radiology to do the tests and monitoring. This is all moving quite quickly. And not only could it all be better coordinated, but there's an opportunity to bring more treatment closer to home, particularly with oral medications and telehealth. And for stem cell transplant services, we're refreshing the whole model of care, looking at how the pathway operates from when you're referred to when you're discharged, where services are located, what is needed at all points for this to be done well, and how we build in a system that ensures that services grow as demand and need changes. As part of this work, we're very lucky to meet face-to-face at the beautiful Lyall Bay Surf Club in Wellington earlier this year to workshop with clinicians, consumers and advocates on how we could provide better stem cell services. And we did all the usual workshop things with presentations and post-it notes, but the highlight of the day and a reminder to us all of the purpose of this work was the generosity shown by someone who went through transplant just recently. Her wairoa and tenacity not only supported her through her own journey, but has made a significant impact on everyone who had the privilege to be part of her treatment team. And now, as just one example, we have a personally designed poster in our hospital rooms that guides patients, whanau and staff to working within Te Whare Tapa and using te reo in everyday practice. The poster on the slide just now is living proof that everyone's voice has a part to play in how we change the system for the better. That remains a big job, but one we're passionate about. It is also not something we are doing alone. And we know it's been a difficult couple of years for services, for communities, for all of us. And we are hugely grateful for the time, insights, and passion for change that everyone has and continues to show throughout this process. Through our cancer services planning work, the range of other activities we're engaged with, and the new opportunities that emerge in this ever-changing environment, we will strive relentlessly for a system where all New Zealanders are able to access cancer care that meets our obligations, that is high quality, sustainable, whanau-centred and delivers equity for all people, especially those with blood cancer. Ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thanks so much, Cushla, for your wonderful presentation. Absolutely amazing. Just a reminder to everyone to use the question and answer section at the bottom. We've already got a few questions there, so that's awesome. If you can put those through, and we'll have our panelists come back on board at the end to answer all of our questions. Which brings us to our final speaker of the afternoon/evening, the wonderful Raewyn Moss, who is a member of our Consumer Advisory Board here at Leukemia and Blood Cancer New Zealand, who will give us a glimpse in what it is to be a consumer on the Consumer Advisory Board and an update on what they do. Over to you, Raewyn.
Lovely, thanks, Tim. I'll just get you to bring the slides up if I can, and then we'll get underway. Okay, so kia ora tātou. It's lovely to be here. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today. And I've really enjoyed listening to Peter and Cushla. So what I'm going to do today is introduce you to the Consumer Advisory Board. So we're established to help leukemia and blood cancer in their work. So, you know, put really simply, the Consumer Advisory Board provide leukemia and blood cancer with the patient voice. We provide advice that might be strategic or tactical on elements of LBC's work from a patient or a consumer perspective. So sort of standing in the shoes of a patient. So the board brings together patients, caregivers, and all parts of LBC involved in providing services to us as patients, and also the funding of those services. And as Consumer Advisory Board members, we provide a connection for LBC with those they're trying to serve, so they can provide services that support and better meet patient needs. Feedback from patients and from carers, what they're going through on their blood cancer or blood condition journey, is super important in terms of helping to shape those services and to improve them, and be that for patients or also for carers that support our patients. So I'll touch on the specifics of what we do later, but firstly, let's just take a quick look at who we are. So the board comprises 11 members in total. I think we are at the moment. Whoops, sorry, I've just snuck back. I've advanced my slides. There we go. We'll just go back. Bear with me. Here we are, getting ahead of myself. So 11 members in total at the moment, and we're a blend of people who can bring knowledge and experience from the perspective of our own conditions, and collectively across all the various blood cancers and conditions that LBC represent. So we have a good mix of age, a good mix of ethnicity, and also of gender. We have all the major blood cancers represented, and some of the ones that are not quite so common as well. And we have a mix of people from right across the country, as Cushla has said, you know, services, and we're acutely aware of this as well. Services and experiences can vary markedly across the country. We also have partner and caregiver representatives with us as well, and they provide some very useful insights from their perspective. So what you'll see here on the slide is this is us on one of our Zoom meetings with LBC. I think this was in lockdown last year when Auckland was in lockdown for the extended period. And, you know, like all of us, due to COVID, we haven't been able to meet as regularly face-to-face as we'd like. But you know, that's something that's affected all of us, that's for sure. And we've had to use online technology to keep us connected and to keep us contributing to the good work of LBC. So let's look at, you know, what we do as a board just in a little bit more detail. And one of our board members prepared these very sort of helpful impact infographics for us last year, which nicely summarise up our work and what we've contributed to over the last few years. And I think they'll give you a really good sense of what we do. So one of our key areas of activity is communication support. So here we help LBC shape up a number of things. So it could be their campaigns, such as Blood Cancer Awareness Week, which is a key promotion globally for blood cancers, which happens every September. So, and as Peter mentioned earlier on, we're in that as we speak. So you keep a lookout for all the various sort of activities this month. And of course, I think for those of you in Auckland today, I think the Sky Tower is being turned red as recognition of this as well. And so that's a great thing to see happen. Something that's sort of very visual and gets a lot of attention out there. So we also assist LBC in identifying sort of where there are gaps with their fact sheets and their booklets that LBC produces. So that might be in terms of topics or content within the booklets or the fact sheets themselves. And we also help with reviewing them from a patient or a carer perspective. We're involved with reviewing and looking at the content of the disease-specific publications. whether it's the look and feel of those publications or the content as well. So a good example of this is Lifeblood, which I'm sure those online, many of you will receive that. And you might have noticed when you got the last edition, which came out probably about 6-8 weeks ago now, maybe, if I remember correctly. It's had a bit of a it looks fresher, and Lifeblood has had a revamp this year in terms of its design and presentation. And we were fortunate enough as a board to have a bit of a sneak peek of that after contributing some ideas last year in terms of how could that publication be more impactful. And this panel session is the first of many over September as part of LBC's Blood Cancer Forum, which of course they run annually. And as a Consumer Advisory Board, we help LBC shape up the topics for the Blood Cancer Forum, the agenda, and help with make suggestions on speakers. So in terms of from a patient or a carer perspective, what are patients and carers wanting to know? What worries them? What would be helpful? And what could be usefully addressed as a forum topic? So it's always great to see the forum actually come to life, and we certainly missed it in the year that we were unable to do it in 2020. And it's great to be here as part of the first session, the opening session for the forum this year. And of course, there's 4 other sessions to follow during September, so make sure you get along to those. And LBC, like all of us, has had to adapt in the way it's been providing services during the COVID pandemic and in navigating our various lockdowns. So we've all had to learn how to operate online in non sort of face-to-face ways, much more than we ever did prior to 2020. I think probably if you talk to any of us, probably most of us had never sort of used Zoom or Teams online probably before about March 2020. But here we are, we're all quite competent with it now. So as a board, we've also provided insights to LBC on how to get the most out of these online sessions and what might work best in terms of facilitating them. And we're acutely aware that, online sessions certainly don't work for everyone. We absolutely know that. But unfortunately, they have become a necessary part of our world since 2020 in terms of sort of keeping us connected. So another area that the Consumer Advisory Board assists with is in the area of research or surveys. So when I'm talking about research here, I'm meaning market research as opposed to the sort of research that Professor Browett was talking to you about. So LBC regularly surveys their patients and caregivers to better understand their needs and whether their services are meeting those needs. So as a Consumer Advisory Board, we review and help shape up the survey questions which are used and which I'm sure many of you will have responded to. And we're always really interested just to review the survey results to understand what's working out there and where improvements could be made. They're sort of super helpful in terms of working out how to sort of tune the various services. And similarly, from time to time, LBC is asked to contribute a New Zealand perspective to perhaps disease-specific international surveys. So we'd rely on our board member with that particular condition to assist with this type of request. For instance, I helped out a couple of years ago on one that was designed around MPN research and research around MPNs and how that was working in New Zealand. And fundraising is a really important part of LBC's mahi in terms of providing the funding for all the various services delivered across the country. And a shout out to the marketing team who won the awards last night. That's awesome news. So the marketing team keep us across their campaigns, what's planned and how they're going. So that could be the flagship campaigns that we're probably all quite familiar with. So such as Shave for a Cure, the Firefighter Sky Tower Challenge and Step Up. And a number of our Consumer Advisory Board members have also taken part in those challenges. One's been brave enough to don the firefighting suit and do the Sky Tower Challenge. And I think a number have been involved in Step Up challenges. And it's always great to get out there and on the ground and support these challenges. It's good fun and it's rewarding. Marketing teams also taking us through their ideas for new campaigns and how these could be run, for us to provide feedback and to help us shape, to provide insights that help shape those campaigns before they are sort of locked down and finalised. So a really good example of this, and it's a recent one, is the Fundraise Your Way campaign. This is a great campaign. It's one that's sort of super flexible and it allows people to fundraise in many different ways, be it through a sports activity or something more sedentary, creating your own sort of fundraising event. So that could be at work, or it could be with family, it could be with friends, or through gifts and donations. So there's lots of options with that one. And we've also played a role in patient advocacy in a number of areas, including when Te Kahu, so the Cancer Control Agency, was established. This included being on the establishment stakeholder group and in providing feedback on the agency's website when it was first set up. As you can imagine, when an agency gets established, and they were in at very, very early stages, there weren't many staff, and they were reaching out for assistance in all sorts of ways to help them get going. And we've also helped shape a number of patient or caregiver education sessions. For example, there's an employment workshop which provides you with what you need to know when navigating conversations with your employer around the time that you might need off for treatment, or helping caregivers work through and adjust to their life after a bereavement. So that's a snapshot really of some of our mahi, probably some of our sort of bigger activities. There's many more sort of smaller things that we're involved with from time to time. And what you'll be able to get a sense of from that is our mahi is certainly very varied. And I've gone one too many. There we go. Not good with this, am I? So that should give you it gives you a bit of a sense of what the Consumer Advisory Board is all about. And I know I can speak for all of us on the board when I say this, but we really enjoy the work we do on the Consumer Advisory Board and in contributing towards improved outcomes for blood cancer patients in New Zealand and for those that support blood cancer patients. There's never enough money to go around for all the various things that LBC would like to do, and it's super important that we can ensure that the money that is available is being spent wisely and where it's needed most, and we play a key role in that. So while we're one important means of providing the patient voice to LBC to guide us and to guide their work, we're not the only means. So if you have ideas and suggestions as a patient or a carer, you can always raise them with your local LBC support services coordinator in your area, or via the 0800 numbers or the email support services email address there on the screen. So thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I'll hand back to you, Tim.
All right, cool. So we just had a small request from everyone that's at in the offices, just for a few moments to ask the attendees to come up with a few questions. So I'll invite all of our panelists to come back on board. We've got 4 questions that we have already sorted. How's everyone feeling to answer these questions? Excited? Yeah, woohoo! Really excited to answer these questions. So I think while we answer these questions, those who are in our centres who are asking those people who have come along, if you guys can ask questions of people who are attending, and then we will answer these questions that we have currently. So I guess the first question comes from Wellington, and this one's for you, Peter Browett. Could you please comment on CAR-T and myeloma? How far away will this be in New Zealand? Will it only be available via clinical trial to start?
Okay, thanks, Tim. So I think, to be honest, it probably is, particularly in the myeloma area, as some time off, and it's hard to put sort of a time frame around that. I mean, the most mature data is in the ALL and lymphoma area. So those are the areas that have got the equivalent of MedSafe and PharmAc sort of funding. So the UK through NICE, and in Australia through their TGA, and they actually didn't fund it through their PBS, which is equivalent of our PharmAc. It got a separate funding mechanism. We've been in discussion with the companies that have got those constructs, the CAR T cell, and they've made a decision in the New Zealand environment. They're not actually pushing for the funding, and so we're probably going to need to drive that ourselves. There's LBC, hematology, Te Kahu, and I think there's some work going on there. The myeloma, the data actually looks very promising, but we've got, and it's good to see that this was Janssen Selag who have gone for the EPA approval. Their next step will be MedSafe, and then it'll go into discussions around what the funding mechanism is. But at least it's exciting that we've got to this first step. Your second question is, will it only be as part of clinical trial? Hard to know. Janssen Selag have that company have had discussions with us as to, I think they're interested in bringing clinical trials here, and so clinical trials often gives us access to new treatments and new technologies sooner than other mechanisms. So I feel a bit like a politician of dodging around and not actually answering your question because I don't know all the answers to it, but I think realistically, this is exciting, but there's still more work sort of to do on it. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Peter. Next question, we're going to go to Cushla. This one comes out to you. With many patients having treatment away from their local area, is there anything planned to assist with keeping families together? In particular, sole parents being able to stay in accommodation with their child, even on weekends, or there are breaks in treatment. It was excessively expensive to have to pay for a hotel in order to maintain my relationship with my daughter.
Absolutely, and this comes up time and time again. And the current system around particularly travel and accommodation, but the wider ideas of support, we know is not meeting people's needs. A little similar to Peter's answer, I don't have the answer to that, but it is a priority for us, and we know that it will make a difference to the experience and probably in the outcome for people who are needing to seek treatment. So yes, completely agree. It needs to be better. It needs to be a core part of having treatment, and it needs to be easy and much easier than it is now. So it's on our radar. Sorry, I don't have the answer just yet, but this is quite a common thing that comes up across cancer and other treatments where people travel.
Awesome. Thanks, Cushla. Next one's coming back to you, Peter Browett. From how come we are so focused on CAR-T when we don't have funding for BK inhibitors available in other countries? We are importing these from other countries with approval of our specialists from developing countries. What's your comment, pretty much?
Yeah, look, I agree fully with that. So, and I apologise. I mean, the purpose of my talk was really to focus on what's new, what's on the horizon, and yet we've got, and you could take CLL, our lack of funding of the BTK inhibitors, limited access to venetoclax, the BCL2 inhibitor, and we could go through, myeloma, we're waiting for funding for some of the new drugs there, daratumumab into the ALL, blinatumomab and AML, midostaurin, so it's, I think it is, so I think those are equally, it's not as though one's more important than another. And I think it's, those drugs have most of them are registered, have been approved by MedSafe. They're in the Pharmac process. Some of them have been sitting there for 3 to 4 years. Peter may want to comment is that, LBC is that, one of the key roles of LBC is advocacy. We've taken a line of, of using the Kango, it's the process that needs to change. I mean, you can get, there's the odd drug, particularly around elections, gets over the line, but in fact, Pharmac needs, they need more funding, they need a different process to review them. So look, I agree fully with the comments there that we need, those drugs, some of them have been sitting there that are standard of care. I think the comment with the CAR T, why I'm focusing on that is that it is a substantial sort of breakthrough in the management of blood cancers. It's going to extend into other cancers as well. The research is there. It's Cushla knows, I've discussed this. It's not something that you can just introduce. It's going to take time to get ourselves sort of to develop the technology around the laboratory processes, the care process. So we need to start working on that sort of now. But I agree fully with you. Those, a lot of these small molecule inhibitors, the antibodies, they're there. We're waiting for a decision on the funding, and perhaps I might just push it back to the other Peter, just in terms of how LBC's, how our advocacy role here.
Well, we keep reminding Pharmac which are some of our key priorities, but you're right. The underlying issue, which unfortunately was taken out of the Pharmac review, was funding, because the pushback is usually that they don't have the budget to be able to fund those, which seems to be the fallback for just about all of those decisions and delays. So even the funding that was approved recently and promoted was relative. It sounds like a big number, but it was a relatively small drop in the bucket. I think it's certainly far less than the increase in costs that we're seeing coming through at the moment. So it's barely keeping up with funding. So yeah, funding seems to be the biggest challenge at the moment.
All right, thanks, Peter and Peter. Next question is for Raewyn. Is additional support for patients' primary carers being looked at? In Australia, they have additional assistance, i.e. phone support, carers card with discount.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and that's an interesting question. And I mean, certainly really what we need to think about is patients and carers collectively. And we are conscious of that as part of the Consumer Advisory Board and our advice to LBC. There's certainly support available for carers, but as I say, it is certainly an area that I think we're conscious that we probably need to sort of focus a little bit more on primary caregivers, because they're just as important, really, as the patient in terms of sort of navigating sort of through treatment journeys and things. So I think sort of thinking about them as a collective is a useful way to think about it. In terms of comparisons with what's available directly in Australia, in terms of what New Zealand, what LBC offers, I can't comment on the detail of that. I don't know whether Tim or Peter can, but thank you for the point, and one that we'll keep in mind.
Yep, just to add to that answer, you can contact your support service coordinator that's available in your region. and they can help you out with with your carer support. We currently have a nationwide carers call that we hold on Zoom, and that's been quite successful in terms of connecting carers across the nation and getting peer support for one another. Awesome. Next question is from a CLL patient, and she talks about, or he talks about being referred, haven't been referred to the hematologist because their symptoms aren't bad enough, and the GP doesn't know much about this. In other countries, you'd get a referral. Assuming that this is coming out to you, Peter Browett, or also to Cushla as well, and what your guys' thoughts are on this.
It's probably at me. Look, I sympathise fully with that comment, because GPs, I mean, I think I'm a specialist hematologist. GPs, I think, do a fantastic job because they're seeing a myriad of medical issues, and the issue with the disease, the condition like CLL, is that early stage CLL, the recommendation may just be for initially sort of very careful observation and careful sort of monitoring of laboratory studies, clinical well-being, and examination. But the nuances around that and the discussions as to why that is, I wouldn't expect a GP to have that knowledge. I think a lot of and I'm not defending this because I disagree with that, but I think a lot of the clinical services around the country have been pushed, and so they've made a decision not to, for those referrals to be pushed back to the GP, and with some recommendations. I think it's my own view is that I think we have a responsibility to see, and it may just be an initial consultation, and then the GP can do the monitoring. I don't know whether that's ever come up out of the hematology working group, Peter or Cushla, as to having some consistency, because it probably varies around centres and regions, and so whether with our new health reforms, whether there'll be some more uniform guidelines for assessment.
I can probably add to that. One of the parts of cancer services planning I didn't touch on when I spoke about the 3 aspects that I did was another part of work called optimal care pathways, and that's sort of a longer term part of work, but it does, probably not specific to the conversation raised by this question, but it does look at that very thing of how do the different parts of the healthcare sector work together to wrap around the best care. So this is less about support, but that's part of it. But the other part of the story is around what's the role of primary care? How can primary, specialist and tertiary care work together? Where's the best way to do that? And how do people feel safe and supported by the help that they're getting or the advice that they're getting? So that is something that we're looking at generally and generically, but it's a very, very valid question.
Cool. And I can just add that if you are diagnosed with CLL and you're not seeing a primary hematologist, you're still more than welcome to access our support services, and we can help you out with the various questions that you might have. Next question is just combined with quite a few questions, is just about the genetic mapping that you spoke about, Peter. Is that available to the public? And if you can do the genetic mapping, are you able to kind of target those genes with current treatment to treat blood cancer?
Yeah, look, I'm maybe misunderstanding the question. So that the genetic mapping often refers to more of the inherited or congenital disorders. So a strategy where you may have a family that have got an inherited condition, but it's or the congenital condition, and so that genetic mapping of looking at the parents and affected family members to see whether you can find either particular linked markers. And so that's is still, it's not the area I work in, but it's still in the research area. I know a lot of the pediatricians and groups, they are looking at that. if we're referring more to, so that's in the for congenital or possibly an inherited disorder where it may not be something like a hemophilia or hemochromatosis, where there's there's a clear pathway for the gene analysis, but more congenital abnormality of doing the sort of mapping. That's still in the New Zealand environment, is still in the research area. If we're looking at the gene mapping of patients in the blood cancer area, so if someone's got a blood cancer, that genetic testing, look, I think that's I think it's growing. I think it's now more across the myeloid blood cancer, so acute myeloid leukemia, the myeloproliferative neoplasms, and it's one of the things I think that stemmed from the research supported by LBC, the myeloid panel, and then making sure that we've got equitable access to this across the country. I think there is that testing, so in that myeloid area, and we're meeting now and developing guidelines, and so I think that's happening. I think in the lymphoid malignancy, the myeloma, that's still further away and more still in the research area. So I apologize if I've misinterpreted the question.
I think you answered it just fine. Next one's just for Cushla. We've got someone asking whether there's a review going into the National Travel Assistance, and is it likely to be extended to support for both petrol costs and accommodation?
Another excellent question. There was some work done, or possibly a couple of years ago now, on the NTA policy, and there were some recommendations that were made from that were with the Ministry of Health. I think one of the most honest answer to say from our perspective at the moment is that in general, national travel and accommodation across all health specialties and diseases, there is it's still unknown how that will fit and work within the new system, and until then, obviously, just the status quo remains. But I suppose to reiterate what we said before is that our view is that that system's not serving cancer patients well in a universal way, as well as it's really underserving those that need the help most. But it won't be our job to sort of determine rates and that moves on, but we are advocating as strongly as we can for that. So a little bit of wait and see in this space.
Awesome. Thanks, Cushla. Peter's quite popular. Next one's for you. Just with the combined health services, questions being asked about how blood tests will be changed / standardized, in particular the VAF testing for PV.
Okay. So look, I think the National Health Service came into force on the 1st of July. So I think there's still a lot of work, and I think we're all still learning here. So, but in terms of your question, so the VAF, this relates to the variant allele fraction in patients with myeloproliferative neoplasms, particularly polycythemia vera, where we want to look at the JAK2 allele burden. And I think there's been very limited access to this across the country. I know our lab has been able to offer that informally. Part of again, with the development of the myeloid gene panel, and we've had national working group looking at how we do the testing for the myeloproliferative neoplasms, and that the guideline there is that the testing should be done with reporting of a variant allele fraction. So that's our national sort of guidelines. So that's been sort of promulgated and around all the hematology units. So I would think that there should be more equitable access to that testing where it's thought to be important in the management of the patient. So I think it's a flow-on effect of the the development of the myeloid gene panel and making sure that we've got more uniform access and more uniform testing across the country.
Awesome. Next one is just for you, Peter Fergusson. What's the best way for individuals to contribute or support these research programs?
It would be probably working through their own specialist and clinician to understand which ones are available within New Zealand. So most of the lead clinicians, and Peter Browett might be able to chime in on this, would have a reasonable understanding. I know there's a hematology research group that gets together on a reasonably regular basis. Travis Pereira heads it, and they talk about the trials that are opening in New Zealand, what's available, and they keep the clinicians pretty much up to date around the country. So having involvement, I would imagine, would be talking with their specialist hematologist, making sure that they fit first and foremost, and then secondly, that person should have an understanding of what they could get involved in.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Next one is just for everyone. Is there work around quote unquote rarer cancer types, or do they fall under similar treatment plans based on their markers? That's for everyone. Is there work in Te Kahu? Is there work in with us, or is there work with you, Peter Browett?
So within the blood cancer area, when I think both across the country, it may depend on whether a particular investigator has got a research interest in that area or has got expertise sort of in it. So, but often with those rarer cancers is that we use our international colleagues and link into them and may contribute to their sort of research, because sometimes we may only have 2 or 3 patients with that particular type of sort of blood cancer. So it's difficult for us both from the clinical management perspective, but also from a research perspective from that point of view. I think I don't know, Cushla is probably better to place of how you manage those, in the wider under the brief of Te Aho as to how you approach that.
And not dissimilar actually to what you just said, Peter. It is a challenge, and as you say, very small numbers in a country of our size. I think there's 2 parts to that. Is very much having that clinical expertise and those relationships and connections internationally, but also that recognising that whilst some specifics of the treatment for a rare cancer will be very specific and targeted, on the other hand, a lot of the barriers and obstacles that people report are less to do with the rarity of their cancer or their cancer type, and more about some of the other aspects. So it's putting all of that picture together to improve outcomes. I'm not sure if that's covered that fully enough, but yeah.
I think that's covered it adequately. I think so. We'll just have time for 2 more questions. And I really wanted to ask this one, which was from Anonymous, for Cushla and Peter. Do you see a possibility to push for more clinical trials as an equity issue so that Māori and Pacific patients will have their disease and response to treatment studied, resulting long-term in better outcomes? Sorry, I'm biased in this question because I'm a Polynesian myself.
Who wants to go first?
This Peter, I've got an easy answer, which is yes.
I'm not sure which Peter it is, but I'm happy to answer that as well. Look, I think absolutely, and I think it's I think it's responsibility of for our both in the health service sector, and also I've noted there's a big change around funding bodies for sort of research have absolutely have to address this area. So it's critical for LBC. some of the other sort of cancer area researchers as well. So yeah, I think this is really important for us to address. Yeah.
That's our position as well. So our State of the Nation report found very clearly that cancer research is not always distributed in a way that targets equity or to territory obligations. So we need to start looking at where we can make the biggest gains and prioritise that.
All right. Our final question, which is very controversial. Why do the pharmaceutical companies charge so much for their drugs? Some of these new drugs are costing many thousands of dollars. Anybody want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I'll jump in on it because I've already got lots of friends in the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, I think this is a really good question, and it's you look at the CAR T cells. So in the US, is that for some of the original CAR T cells, just for the genetic modification of the cells, are somewhere around $400,000 for the modification. You've got some of the new drugs that we discussed before, the BTK inhibitors are all, I mean, a lot of it's we don't see the exact costing, but often upwards of $100,000 a year for the treatment. So part of it is that, and I acknowledge this, they need to recover their costs on for the investment in the drugs, because out of all the drugs that come through that are their initial discovery and through their laboratory-based research and then through into the clinical trial and then the final phase 3 clinical trials where you compare, is that there's somewhere around out of 10 of those, there's 9 of them won't progress into the clinic. So they need to recover that cost. But I think there's also some other costs as well, and a lot of the costing is based on what's perceived as that the market may sustain. So it looks at what competitor drugs may sort of cost. So I think when we have that discussion and we aim criticism at Pharmac, I think there probably needs to be some responsibility out of the industry as well.
Awesome. Thanks for those lovely questions. I'd like to thank
I thought Cushla might like to deal with that one as well.
Yeah.
Peter, I think you did an excellent job. Thank you very much.
Well, on behalf of Leukemia and Blood Cancer New Zealand, I'd like to thank our panel for coming along tonight and give them one final quote that they might want to share for our patients who are out there in the community, remembering that this session is entitled "We've Got Your Back," and I hope that, you can see that all of us here have your back in terms of going through your blood cancer. So if we start with if we go through from the beginning, from Peter to Cushla to Raewyn, and then we'll finish off with myself.
Short quote. Okay, we definitely have your back. We're here. We will always be here. We understand the difficulty that you guys go through, and we want to be part of that journey and part of the family to help you through. So please lean on us, lean into us. The team at the front end, people like Tim and my support team are outstanding people, and I know that they'll get behind you and support you. So definitely lean into LBC. We're here to help.
I think that's to me next. So look, 2 comments. One is I just want to acknowledge that the huge work of LBC and their, as a clinician with their, around their patient and whanau support, their advocacy and their support of research. I sense coming through here from some of the comments, just looking at the Q&A around that sort of the frustration of the therapies that we'd like to be able to access. I think on the other hand, we do have, when I look at the nurses and my sort of the colleagues working in there, I think there's a team that are providing the best care that and a contemporary sort of care, and I think everybody's really working hard, particularly, and I acknowledge this has been a tough couple of years for our patients, but I think everybody's there has got your back.
I'd like to echo Peter and sort of draw attention to that. Often, you know, when we are striving for improvement, it's easy to forget how much incredibly good work is done across the sector. And, you know, we were really clear when the agency was established, this was, you know, not something we could ever do on our own, and the work of our system, of our non-government organisations such as LBC, and the staff and the people who work is really what makes the difference. That said, if there's room to do better, then we should do better, and that's really what we're striving for. And, you know, we should continue to look for opportunities to do better in the future. So thank you so much for having us tonight. It was an absolute honour to be here. Yeah, very thanks.
Okay, and lastly from me, so as a Consumer Advisory Board, we've absolutely got your back as well. So help us help LBC deliver great services for you as patients and carers. We need insights to get the system to improve, as Cushla says, and as Peter says, you know, I think LBC do an awesome job, and as to wider parts of the system. But you know, the more we know about people's pain and so on, the more we can get improvements. So back to you, Tim. Awesome.
Final word is just number one for everyone out there. We've got your back, and that just means that we care. That's our mission. And we care from just the bottom of our hearts to make sure that you guys are doing well in your treatment. And so we thank you for attending the opening session today for our Blood Cancer Patient Forum, and wish you all a very good evening. And if you're having something yum to eat, enjoy that. And we say goodbye. Thanks everyone for joining in, and thank you to our panel.